All right. Well, welcome again, everybody, to teaching about settler colonialism in North America. So excited to have you here and joining me for this webinar. Feel free to add as we go any comments and things into the chat. I am a one-man show tonight, and so I don't have anybody monitoring the chat for me as I'm going through some of the slides, and so I apologize for that, but I'll try to reserve some time towards the end where we can take a look at some of those questions. Um, and so with that, I'm going to jump in and just start with something that has become rather pro forma in academic spaces in the United States, and that is a land acknowledgement. And um, I guess I'd like to start with this statement from the National Council for the Social Studies, which states that all teaching and learning take place on Indigenous land. And I currently live and teach on Ho-Chunk land in what is today South Central Wisconsin. So I'm coming from a small town called Beloit. And my students and I that live and learn here in Beloit, which is again just a small community along the Illinois-Wisconsin border, um, we can think about this community's existence really can be traced back to, I mean, the first settlers came here in 1836. The first Euro-American settlers came here in 1836, mostly from New England, looking for farmland. But really, their settling in this area of Wisconsin can be traced back to a war just a few years before they came in 1836, and that is the 1832 Black Hawk War, which is a brief war between several indigenous groups and the U.S. government. Both Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln fought in the war, along with, I mean, just incredibly, seven future US senators, four future Illinois governors, future governors of Michigan, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, and two future US presidents. I already mentioned Lincoln and Taylor. Um, the aftermath of this war really gave teeth to the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and resulted in the expulsion of many Ho-Chunk and other indigenous peoples from south central Wisconsin. The Black Hawk War really cleared this rich farmland where I'm located in southern Wisconsin for white settlement. And I think it's important to point out that my students don't learn about this history. I taught high school social studies near here. I now teach at Beloit College, and my high school students and indeed my college students have no understanding of this history. Um, I think maybe it's important if we're going to recognize that all teaching and learning take place on Indigenous land, to recognize that most teaching and learning take place in settler spaces. And so this is my classroom when I was a high school social studies teacher, just 5 miles down the road from Beloit. And this is where my students, right, weren't learning this history. It wasn't part of the formal curriculum that they were being taught in their K-12 experience. And though my students may have learned about, and many did, right, talk about learning about, have memories of learning about the so called Trail of Tears, this map maybe expands our notion of the Trail of Tears slightly and includes the Black Hawk War and these expulsions from Wisconsin. But certainly, this wasn't part of the narrative that they learned about when thinking about the Black Hawk Wars. And so I want to kind of start from that point a little bit, right? This notion that my students weren't learning about this history, even though they were maybe talking about the Trail of Tears, they weren't talking about this local history of the Black Hawk War. And I think this is yeah, I guess, leads into some questions that I really use to kind of ground my research and my teaching. And these questions are, can social studies education? I was a social studies teacher for many years, and now I train future social studies teachers. Maybe we think about public schooling or education in general. Can these things function as and for social justice in settler colonial nation states, such as the United States? States. And we'll get into defining what settler colonialism is in just a moment. Maybe to borrow a question from Sandy Grande, can democracy be built on the bloody soils of genocide? And I think thinking about some of the gaps in my students' knowledge, I question whether we can think about social studies or public education as a vehicle for social justice. Um, so, my name is George Dalbo. Just a brief introduction. I mentioned I was a high school teacher, social studies teacher. I also taught middle school social studies for many years, both here in Wisconsin and also in Minnesota. And I now am a professor at Beloit College training future teachers. And a lot of my research and a lot of my teaching centers around those questions that I just had up on the screen, but also this maybe more specific question here. Um, what does it mean to teach and learn about genocide in a settler colonial society which has not fully recognized histories and legacies of mass violence? I'm really interested, to put it more plainly, what does it mean to teach about the Holocaust and so-called other genocides? Think about the Armenian genocide or Rwandan genocide, genocide in ex-Yugoslavia. What does it mean to teach about these genocides in the United States when we're not also teaching about indigenous genocide? And I know from my research that most teachers that do take up these topics are not teaching about indigenous genocide, and hopefully, folks that are joining us today are the exception to that. But it seems the rule is that we are not teaching about indigenous genocide in the United States in the ways that maybe we are teaching about other genocides. And I guess to put it in another sense, what I'm interested in are these settler spaces. If most teaching and learning takes place in these settler spaces, I'm interested, and my research examines these settler spaces and specifically looks at genocide education within these settler spaces. I guess I say this to also say I'm not indigenous, and I'm not tonight in this webinar trying to represent or explore indigenous histories and culture. I'm more interested in thinking about this from a settler perspective, and pushing us to think about settler histories, settler legacies in the United States. Um, and so I'd like to start with a little bit of an activity for us. And this is something that I do with my students. And it might seem a little off-putting or even offensive at first, but stick with me for just a moment. So the prompt here, and this is the prompt I would give my students, asks you to draw an American Indian. Draw what comes to mind when you think of this term American Indian. And maybe for our purposes here tonight, I put in parentheses imagine, in this kind of activity of association. When I say American Indian, what sort of images come to mind for you? And so this isn't my question. It's not my prompt. I've taken this from Patrick LeBeau, who is a professor of American Indian Studies and Writing at Michigan State. And LeBeau has asked this question of many people, young and old, across the United States, and collects their drawings. And when I do this with my high school students, and indeed now with my college students, I collect their drawings as well. I'm interested in kind of growing my collection of these. And I can say that these are drawings from LeBeau, but drawings from my students look very similar. And I've done this activity for a number of years, and I end up with the same images that LeBeau ends up with. You can think of feathered headdresses, teepees, bows and arrows, tomahawks, maybe the odd canoe or other dwellings, buffalo skins. We get these kind of stereotypical images of in, indigenous peoples and their culture. But also these images, LeBeau points out, and others have pointed out, are kind of drawn from this imagined 19th century plains Indian. right? Think the Sioux, right? The Lakota, Dakota, Nakota peoples, right? These kind of stereotypical images from this kind of amalgam, this imagined 19th century native peoples. And this is very curious, right? That this is, it cuts across different age groups all over the United States. It cuts across geography, so space and time. These are the persistent images of native peoples in the United States. And I can think about my own education and where some of these images might come from for me and for others. So this is a project that I did in a social studies class in fourth grade that my mother luckily saved, pulled out and saved. And you can see the little essay I wrote here about Sitting Bull, and you can see the drawings that I did. I actually remember doing this assignment in fourth grade, not because of the content, but because this is one of the first, or maybe the first thing that I was asked to type on, the lone classroom computer and print out and illustrate. And so you can think about how education works to reinforce these images that we then see, children and adults alike reproduce when asked this question, draw or imagine an American Indian. Um, it's interesting to me. I grew up in New York State, Western New York, and I actually grew up very close to the Seneca Allegheny Reservation. So the Seneca Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee, and we never, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I remember, talked about the Iroquois, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee in my K-12 education. But at some point, apparently in fourth grade, I was learning about, the Sioux and these Plains Wars, this kind of 19th century history. And so it's interesting to ask this question, why? And certainly we could ask it of the students that I teach now, right? With thinking about the Black Hawk War that they don't learn about, but they might talk about the Trail of Tears at some point in their education, but not connect the Black Hawk War to the larger narrative of the Trail of Tears. Um, if we think about the landscape on which we live, and I'll just talk about where I live. So I live in Clinton, Wisconsin, which is a small community just outside of Beloit, where I teach. And in the middle of Clinton is a small park, aptly named Settler Park. And there's a cabin there. And this cabin has a local historical marker associated with it. And the marker reads, "This structure of hand-hewn oak stood on the farm of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Williams. It was erected during the 1830s by Eric and Ragnhild Skavlem. It now stands as a visible reminder of the sacrifices made by early pioneers as they settled this area." And what's interesting about local historical sites like this, and indeed they exist all over the United States, is that there's no mention of the indigenous people that lived, the Ho-Chunk, who lived on this land just a few years before the first Euro-American settlers began to show up and settle the farmland that is Clinton and Beloit, Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin. If we take a look at another marker, this is in Beloit, so just 5 miles away from Clinton, where I'm currently sitting now. And this talks about, this is indeed a Wisconsin historical, a state historical marker, and it's titled "The U.S. Military at Turtle Village." And the sign reads, "In this vicinity, during the Black Hawk War of 1832, Sauk Indian leader Black Hawk and his followers left Illinois and entered the Michigan Territory, which is now Wisconsin, seeking refuge with the Ho-Chunk Indians at Turtle Village. On July 1st, 1832, more than 5 weeks after Black Hawk left Turtle Village and continued his northern retreat up the Rock River, General Henry Atkinson and his troops arrived here only to find an abandoned Indian settlement with extensive gardens and fields of grain." And so this marker certainly mentions the indigenous people that were here before this area was settled by Euro Americans a few years later. And so talking about this war. But what's interesting for me is it doesn't make any mention of the violence of this war. It all seems very peaceful that this, US militia force was, kind of chasing around this group of Sauk Indians, right, or Ho Chunk indeed. And but we don't get any mention of the violence. It's almost as if they came upon this village and the village was empty, and that's all we're left with. And if we take these two markers together, so the one in Clinton that mentions the first settlers, and this one in Beloit that seems to be mentioning the last of the Ho Chunk or the Sauk native peoples that were here, this is what Jeannie O'Brien, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota, has referred to as replacement narratives. And O'Brien's work is really centered in New England, but I think others have extended this to communities all over the United States, big and small, and located these replacement narratives. O'Brien talks about these as a process of firsting and lasting. Firsting is a claim that non-Indians were the first people to erect proper institutions of social order worthy of notice. And so, if we think about in Clinton, the first settlers, I mean, this is a pattern that's repeated all over the United States. The first white or Euro American babies born in whatever county. And so we memorialize the settler firsts, right? These Euro American firsts, and then we talk about the Native American lasts, so the last of the native peoples that were on this land. And so if we think about this memorial from this marker from Beloit that talks about Turtle Village that's empty as this US militia force enters. And so, there were native peoples here, but they're not here anymore. And so this firsting and lasting, I mean, sometimes you can see this in one sign, here in two, right, that are in close proximity. And I think this has been incredibly powerful for my students to go around and collect examples of these narratives from Beloit and Clinton and other areas. And so this has become a very important part of my course when I push students to think about settler colonialism. Rick Liebeck, who's a professor of education at Mankato State in Minnesota, referred to these narratives, these kind of public narratives that we produce in historical markers and other places, as white public pedagogy. And if we think about Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang, wrote about such narratives as settler moves to innocence, or the moves that attempt to reconcile settler guilt. We don't mention the violence. We don't even, in some cases, mention the indigenous people that were here before settlement, maybe recognizing, even if we're not stating it publicly, that there must have been violence involved, right, to remove these indigenous peoples from the land. Tuck and Yang talk about such narratives as rescuing settler futurity, which we'll mention in just a moment. Um, we could tie this to other histories that are excluded in K-12 education, or indeed in some cases at the college level here. My students aren't aware of this narrative either. This is a newspaper article from the Janesville, which is just up the road, about 15 minutes from Beloit, a slightly larger community with a larger newspaper. But this article talks about 5,000 people who attended a Ku Klux Klan rally in between Clinton and Beloit, just 5 miles apart. And so on farmland in between these two communities, there was this massive rally in 1923. Um, Certainly this was a reaction to Black folks moving to this part of Wisconsin to work in factories in Beloit during World War I, part of the Great Migration, and then perhaps interested in moving out into the surrounding countryside and buying farmland and settling down. And communities from Janesville to Clinton, communities outside of Beloit pushed back, and many of these communities have been labeled as sundown towns, or recognized as sundown towns in their attempt to keep Black residents out. And so my students certainly don't learn about this history either. And we might be able to connect this as we start to think about what settler colonialism is and how this operates. Connect these two things, this kind of erasure or absenting of indigenous narratives, but also this history of white supremacist violence, or this history of Black settlement, or Black folks in this region. And so, if we think a little bit about what settler colonialism is, before we dig into the theory, I think it's important to just state that folks that take up settler colonial theory would recognize that the United States is a settler colonial nation state. Settler colonialism is a relatively new idea emerging, really into kind of popular usage in academia in the 1990s and early 2000s. And it's the idea that settler colonialism is distinct from other types of colonialism, in that settler colonialism is colonialism where colonists, where settlers come to settle land, and stay on that land in perpetuity. And so, if we think about the United States as a country in which settlers came, Europeans, and removed indigenous inhabitants from this land, and then settled the land in perpetuity, or still their descendants are still occupying, living on this land. Um, this is often supported with rhetoric, and I could have picked a quote from any U.S. president, including up to the current President Biden, that kind of reinforce this idea. But here's a quote from William Henry Harrison, who said that the United States is one of the fairest portions of the globe to remain in a state of nature, the haunt of a few wretched savages, when it seems destined to be by the Creator to give support to a large population and to be a seat of civilization. And certainly, this sums up the idea that's often taught in middle and high school social studies, manifest destiny, that the United States is largely empty. What indigenous peoples that do exist are nothing more than, to quote Harrison here, wretched savages who likely should be removed from the land, so that Euro Americans can prosper on this land and turn the United States into this seat of civilization. If we put this in another way, well, first, we can recognize that settler colonial theorists and folks that take up settler colonialism talk about not just the United States, but often Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as similar settler colonial nation states, sharing a very similar history of settlement. Indeed, I'll mention here, though I'm mostly focused on North America tonight, many people have taken up settler colonialism in recent years and applied it to other places around the globe. So certainly we hear quite a bit about the state of Israel as a settler colonial nation state. But theorists are taking this up to explore South Africa or Southern African history, to look at states in countries in Central and South America, and think about what settler colonial theory might offer to understanding the history of these places as well. If we think about settler colonialism, really, settler colonial theorists would say that it's about land. It's about taking indigenous land and occupying that land, and indeed the resources associated with that land, on and under the land. And so, if we look just at this series of maps quickly, these maps, often the way I was probably taught about this, in a series of similar maps, was about settlement. But we could also think about this as native land loss. And so, if we think about going from 1715 to 1819, you can see the land that was lost to Euro Americans. If we move forward to 1864, you can see the land that was lost, including Wisconsin. And then indeed to 1894. and then to today. And so, looking at the land that was lost, that Native peoples lost to settlement to create what is the United States today. And there's much that I think you can do with students looking at where Native land, often we frame these lands as reservations, where these are located today, and noticing really the absence of native land on the East Coast or east of the Mississippi River in many cases. We could look at this in another way too. This is a very well known, I imagine, known to most people in the audience, a painting done by Prussian born, a German born painter, John Gast, called American Progress. And I often ask my students to analyze this image. And we might even spend an entire class period picking this apart, or a good chunk of a class period. I'll just mention a few highlights here. I mean, certainly we see this figure floating across the landscape from east to west. Um, this, though my students often guess is Lady Liberty, is actually Columbia. Lady Liberty being a French, image, but this is Columbia. Columbia has, and a little bit difficult to see here on the screen, but the Star of Empire on her forehead. Um, She's got a telegraph wire that she's stringing along with her. You can see, below her, waves of settlement from, covered wagons to stagecoaches, ultimately to the train. And you can see settlers are driving out the buffalo and native peoples off the edge of the painting. We don't see where they're disappearing to. You can also think about, Columbia bringing the light of civilization, right? To think back to that quote from William Henry Harrison, and driving out the darkness of ignorance or barbarism, however we might interpret this. I often ask my students after we've gone through the painting, what is the book that Columbia is cradling in her arm? And my students often, young and old, guess that this is the Bible. And I think that makes a lot of sense. It meshes with what they have learned about and what we understand as colonialism and imperialism. To think of this as the Bible and the role of Christianity and organized religion, Christian religions in faiths in the colonial process. But what's interesting is if we zoom in, we notice that this is not the Bible. And if I zoom in even more, hopefully you can see that written on here, Gast has put the title School Book. And so interesting to think about the role of schooling, teachers, curricula in the settling of the West in this colonial process in the United States and elsewhere as well. I think for my students, when we talk about education as this kind of colonial logic, this force within this tool of colonization, my students often think of the indigenous boarding schools, the residential schools in Canada, in the United States, and Australia. Um, where native peoples were forced out of their communities, children especially forced out of their communities and placed in these boarding schools across the United States, starting in Carlisle. This is an image of students at the Toma Indian School, which is just north of Madison, here in Wisconsin, at the intersection of two railroads. And so you could imagine why school was built there. And so I think often we talk about maybe the indigenous boarding schools, but less the local history of these boarding schools. My students are certainly aware, but not aware of the schools that existed in Wisconsin. But I wonder about contemporary education. if we think about some of the trends in education, or we just think about contemporary public schooling, what I was doing as a social studies teacher in my classroom, or if we think about American history and the curricula that exists, maybe we think about the prison to school pipeline, and ways to kind of think about public schooling as this kind of colonial project that's ongoing. Dolores Calderon theorized that public school curricula within the settler colonial nation state, within the United States, constitutes settler grammars, or these discursive logics that maintain or help to maintain settler colonial ideologies. So, thinking about contemporary public education as a tool of settler colonialism, and maybe thinking back to this question that I began with, can public schooling, can social studies education serve as and for social justice in a settler colonial nation state? Or is public schooling and social studies education a tool of settler colonial ideologies? If we think about research that might support some of what Calderon is writing about, this is research that was done by Sarah Shear and Sarah's collaborators, looking at state social studies standards, or social studies standards in all 50 states and in Washington, D.C. And so these are the total number. The graph here is showing us the total number of social studies standards that depict Indigenous history. And they're divided. So Shear has divided these pre 1900 and post 1900. So if you look at the darker portion of each bar, which is towards the bottom, is the pre 1900. And the lighter portion towards the top is post 1900. And so you can see that there are very few states that have any real focus, any real mention in their social studies standards of Indigenous peoples, history, and culture post 1900. We are talking about Native peoples in the past. We are talking about the last of the Native Americans. If we think about Jeannie O'Brien and this firsting and lasting. I once was teaching, I was a guest teacher in a sixth grade social studies class in Minnesota and in Minneapolis. And I had a student, after I did a lesson on Indigenous people, the Dakota, um, I had a student come up to me puzzled and said, "Why are we talking about this? I don't understand. Aren't all Native Americans dead? Aren't they gone? Aren't they extinct?" And I think this is an idea that is common enough, right? And reinforced by the fact that we talk about Indigenous peoples as these, as this relic of the past, as something that existed in the past but doesn't exist in the present. And you can see how social studies curricula, at least the standards, are reinforcing this around the United States. I've highlighted here with the arrow Wisconsin, where we have very few standards talking about Native peoples and none talking about Native peoples post 1900. There is a law, a specific piece of legislation in Wisconsin mandating that students learn about Native peoples in the present, post 1900. But many teachers feel that they're complying with that law if they teach about a history of Native peoples pre 1900. If we think about what settler colonialism is, and of course, we're taking a very complex idea, a very complex theory, and simplifying it down to this graphic here. But this is something that I use with my high school and college students to start to make this manageable for them. And then, of course, we can add to this. But I think this graphic has been incredibly helpful. And this is based on the work of Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang and others. So if we think about settler colonialism as a triangle, we might think about these three groups. So we could put at the very top of this, maybe thinking about the power that the settler has or holds, right? We could put this group settler, this idea settler. Settler, it's a group that settles on stolen land. Um, the settler creates laws to make stealing this land legitimate, to make it legal. Um, and indeed, many other laws and systems and structures to support their place within settler colonial society. And in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, we often associate settlerness with whiteness. If we think about the left of this triangle at the bottom, we might think about this idea of Indian, this kind of amalgam, this identity that doesn't really exist if we think about the number of indigenous nations that existed on what is or exist on what is today the United States. But we could think about Indian just as this kind of amalgam, being removed from the land. We could certainly talk about genocide, but removed in many other ways, being erased from the narrative or relegated to these kind of imagined pasts. This, think about the drawings that we looked at the beginning. Often called savages or much worse. And, this continues, though we might not use the word savage. We certainly use language today that, might seem a little bit better, but has the same effect. And we might associate some notion of Indianness with this category of Indian. If we think about the other side, we might use this word slave. Um, Group that was held in bondage, first in slavery, and then we can talk about segregation post slavery, post the Civil War in the United States. Many people like Michelle Alexander have written about the prison system as a new form of segregation, a new form of slavery or enslavement. We can think about a group whose bodies are valued for the labor that those bodies can provide, but not their minds. We value the work they can provide, but not their minds. And we often associate, this category with Blackness in the United States. If we think about what gives this triangle its shape, its structure, we could think about things like treaties or laws or the police system, the criminal justice system in the United States. We could think about the school system, schooling, things like textbooks or the social studies standards that we just looked at, right? That kind of reinforce this notion of settler colonialism. And we can talk about, I do much more with my students to think about immigrants, people that come into the United States from elsewhere and enter into this structure and are kind of pushed into, this category of settler or Indian or slave. We can think about, folks that come across the southern border of the United States, Latino, Hispanic, migrants to the United States. And often there's this kind of narrative of we need these people, people that would be in favor of this sort of migration, right? Often, qualify this and say, well, we need these people for the work that they provide in our society. We can't deport all of these people, as there's been, recent talk of doing. Think about, the collapse in farming. We need people to do this work, the work that we, right, the settler, is unwilling to do. And so we can think about how people are kind of pushed into these categories. My own family came from southern and Eastern Europe, from what is today Slovakia and Italy, and were pushed slowly over time. Maybe weren't seen as settlers, weren't seen as white early on, but were pushed into this category of settler. And if we think about something I think that comes up often with my students is the idea of settler or slave or Indian, whatever terms we put to these categories, that these are identities. And certainly they are taken up by folks and thrust upon folks as identities. But Kei Wen Yang, writing as La Paperson, reminds us that settler is not an identity. Indian is not an identity necessarily, right? Um, Yang writes that settler is an idealized juridical space of exceptional rights granted to normative settler citizens. Um, and maybe the way I've talked about this with my students is that settler, these categories are technologies of the settler colonial state. And so maybe this gives students a little bit of room to play around with these, thinking, I am not a settler, I am not a slave. These are technologies of the state, and I am perhaps being used by the settler colonial state under these kind of categories, under these technologies. Patrick Wolfe, who is one of the, though he would say he's not the father of settler colonial theory and settler colonial studies, that this really grows out of work that Indigenous folks were doing in Australia and the United States and Canada and elsewhere. Patrick Wolfe is one of the first to write about settler colonialism in the way that I'm talking about it tonight, in the way that many folks talk about it. And Wolfe wrote very powerfully that settler colonialism is not an event; it's a structure. This is not an event or a series of events that we can isolate to the late 1800s if we think about the so called Indian Wars, but rather this is a structure that exists, that is ongoing in the United States and elsewhere. Um, Wolfe also writes that the question of genocide is never far from a discussion of settler colonialism. And so thinking about, recent years, over the last, few decades to reframe the indigenous experience as genocide, to reframe some of the events in the United States as genocide. And of course, that fits within this larger than understanding this structure, understanding the United States as a settler colonial nation state. Again, if we think about Indigenous boarding schools, the government of Canada engaged from 2008 to 2015, engaged in a truth and reconciliation process. And the final report of this TRC, the truth and reconciliation process, was really looking at Canada's Indigenous boarding schools, residential schools. The final report recognized these, called these out as cultural genocide. So, saying here that the establishment and operation of residential schools were essential element of this policy to remove Indigenous people from the land. And this policy, they state, can best be described as cultural genocide. And so recognizing that this was a genocidal process. And the United States is catching up to Canada with some of this recognition happening just recently. If we think about, maybe some examples to attach to this triangle that we just looked at, one of the examples that I use with my students is from Peter Pan. Most of them are familiar with this cartoon, created by Disney and released in 1953. There's a song. There's a larger kind of theme of Native Indians in the film, but there's a song, "What Makes the Red Man Red," which includes quite a bit of this language framing Indigenous peoples as savages, but also placing them. You can see here this image. I won't play the song, but I linked it here for those that are interested. Framing Native peoples, portraying them in these kind of imagined, these stereotypical plains Indian, ways from the 19th century. And so you could think of how, popular media reinforces some of this. We could indeed think about sports mascots, and some of these have been changed in recent years, but logos and mascots associated with college and pro and indeed high school here in Wisconsin, several high school sports teams. If we think about another example, this is an example that I pulled a quote from Rush Limbaugh, And, Rush Limbaugh aside, I think this sort of quote, it's a little rougher around the edges, but I think this sort of sentiment was expressed by many people when thinking about Colin Kaepernick and others, especially Black athletes, pro athletes who were kneeling during the national anthem at sporting events. And Limbaugh says at the time, referencing Kaepernick, football fans just wish that they would just shut up and play football. And I think most Americans, he goes on to say, I think most Americans think that they should just shut up and act, shut up and sing, shut up and star in your TV show, just shut up and do what you do, but shut up. And of course, there's quite a bit that you can unpack here with students. Who are the they, though? And students very quickly realize that he's talking about Black Americans. He's talking about Black folks in the United States as pro athletes, as actors, as singers. And if we think back to uh, our triangle here, and we think about this category of slave, this technology, this idea that bodies here are valued for the work that they provide, playing professional sports, acting, singing, whatever it might be. But we don't want to think about or hear what they have to say. We're not valuing their mind. And so I think, thinking about the Peter Pan clip and this, example with Limbaugh and Kaepernick, there are certainly many other examples that we could attach to this triangle to help students really understand how settler colonialism can be seen in how it operates and can be seen in the contemporary United States. If we think of another example that I've used, this is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is, it was in the works for decades, but is ultimately ratified in 2007 by the United Nations. At the time, 143 countries vote yes. There are certainly a number of countries that abstain. And that's, of course, interesting to dig into why those abstentions. But many, many countries vote yes, certainly the majority of countries in the United Nations. There are 4 countries, only 4, that vote no. And those countries are the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And you can dig deeper with students into the language of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and why the United States, Canada, and New Zealand and Australia are voting no. Much of the reason for the no vote with these 4 countries has to do with sovereignty and recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Canada, New Zealand, and Australia have all walked back their no vote to a certain extent and have pledged to enact part of or all of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in these countries. The United States has not, though candidate Obama, before he became President Obama, said that the United States would do so. We have yet to do so. To really take up this declaration after voting no. But perhaps that'll come. If we think about settler colonialism, one of the issues that my students wrestle with, that many, I think, in academia and elsewhere wrestle with, is this idea of decolonization. Tuck and Yang wrote a very powerful essay titled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." Certainly as a teacher and now as a professor, I've been asked to decolonize my syllabi and decolonize my classroom bookshelves and things like that, similar uses of this idea of decolonize or decolonization. Tuck and Yang point out that decolonization really is about land return. We shouldn't be using it in these kind of metaphorical ways. And my students get really stuck on this idea of land return. How could there be land return? How could there be this process of decolonization in any real sense in the United States or Canada? How could we remove or move settlers off of Euro-Americans and others off of this land and return it to Indigenous peoples? And there have been a lot of interesting discussions around this recently. There have been efforts in Minnesota for people to will to leave their property, especially up north in northern Minnesota, where there are some Ojibwe or Anishinaabe nations and reservations, to leave their second properties. It's common in Minnesota for folks to have a cabin, and it might be even shared among several members of a family, right? Cousins all have access to this cabin that they've inherited. And there's been an effort there among some indigenous groups and some activists to say, don't leave us your primary residence, but will, and don't give it to us now. I mean, certainly yes, if you'd like to, but we recognize you're going to use these properties in your lifetime, but then leave them to a native nation, leave them to a native group, so that this land is then being returned to native peoples with little hardship. I mean, I think this is important for these activist groups to say, look, we're trying to do this in a way where we're not, it doesn't represent a hardship for, settler society. This was a cover story in the Atlantic a couple of years ago. David Troyer writing about returning national parks to native tribes, to native nations. And what could this look like? And Troyer doesn't give us too many specifics. It's more this kind of grand piece, focused on an idea, but certainly it seems possible, right? Ironing out these details and returning federal land, parks, national parks, to indigenous tribes to then control. And so there are these efforts and these conversations that are happening in different ways around the United States, locally and nationally. If we think about indigenous resistance, and again, really my focus tonight and my focus in my research is on settlerness and settler spaces. But if we think about how indigenous communities, and I think it's important when teaching about these topics to also include indigenous resistance or survivance, to settler colonialism. And so here's one example that I use with my students, and I pair this with the Peter Pan. But this is Frank Waln, who's a Lakota hip hop artist, Lakota activist, musician. And he has taken this song, this Disney song from Peter Pan, "What Makes the Red Man Red," and has taken this and incorporated his own lyrics into this.
Personally,
I won't play it, but if we
personally,
uh, if we just take a look at some of the lyrics here for a second. Um, he and you can see in parentheses some of the what he samples from the Peter Pan, but he talks about your history books, lies, your holidays, lies, Thanksgiving, lies, and Columbus Day. Tell me why I know more than the teacher. Tell me why I know more than the preacher. Tell me why you think the red man is red, stained with the blood from the land you bled. And goes on from there. And so this interesting, kind of taking this, incredibly problematic and offensive song that's still, by the way, streamable on Disney Plus, and incorporating this into his own lyrics that are, attempting to call out things like this song and others. And so my students find this particularly impactful to take a look at.
personally,
We could also, if we think about the image, the John Gast image of American progress that we looked at, we could think about this as an image that was created called Reversing Manifest Destiny. Um, and so you can see here, a native figure hovering over the landscape, ripping up, pavement, ripping up railroad tracks or roadways, and the return of the buffalo and indigenous peoples, and pushing out the darkness, which here is pollution and smog, and so interesting to kind of think about this as a counter narrative, a potential counter narrative. I'll end with this tonight. I know we're getting close to our time. I have written about how I teach about settler colonialism in my secondary social studies classroom, very similar to how I approach it in a college classroom here in Beloit. And I've also done a little bit with middle school aged students. And though this writing here, this piece is focused on high school students, I think much of it is applicable to middle school, especially upper middle school learners as well. And so the links here, you can easily find it by just Googling teaching and learning about settler colonialism in my name, George Dalbo, and it'll pop up, and it goes through and essentially shares in a narrative form many of the resources that I looked at previewed tonight. And so you can see how I've used those in my teaching. And so I recommend that. It's not necessarily a lesson plan or a full blown curriculum at this point, although I hope to create that moving forward. But at least it does provide this narrative with resources that you can use within your classroom. I'm also excited to say that I have a book coming out in April. And this book, you can see my fourth grade drawing on the cover, right, is the cover art. But this book is a deeper dive into how I have taught about genocide in a high school genocide studies course, incorporating Indigenous genocide, incorporating and thinking about narratives of Black genocide in the United States. And so this is a narrative account, a deep dive into my own teaching and learning about genocide with my students. And my hope is that that will be useful for others that are trying to engage in this work and thinking about settler colonialism, not only as a theory to guide some of the work that they're doing, but teaching explicitly, teaching students about settler colonialism. And so I guess this is a closing question that, given the time we have, I'll just let linger with folks. But how might settler colonialism and settler colonial theory shape teaching and learning in your context, in your classroom, or whatever space you might be in? And hopefully, what we talked about tonight is useful. And again, I would love to hear from folks about what you're thinking. If questions come up or examples of what you're attempting to do in settler spaces that you occupy, or indeed other spaces, feel free to reach out. I'll put this slide back up, which has the links for the slides, but also my email and contact. And I would love to be in touch with folks and hear about what you're doing in your spaces. And with that, it's 5 o'clock. And so I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop recording at this point.